All right. So as I was saying, this is Reed's visualization for Schneider Web. So this data comes from Shodan. I'll talk a little bit more about Shodan if you don't know about it later on in the talk. But at the moment, I just want to give you this view, right? So this is a timeline across the top, and I scroll on it, and then you'll see little dots appear on the map according to the dates that they appear within Shodan. So each of these is a Schneider Web is the query that we use. So these were I guess I'll have to ask Reed to say a little bit more about the PLC. Okay. Okay. Right. Okay. So then in my visualization, I've got the IP address here. The data that comes from Shodan gives you a city and a country. And then I put in vulnerability IDs based on known vulnerabilities that I've found. But of course, they don't exist yet for Reed's work. So we've just titled it Basecamped by Reed Web. Right? Okay. So this gives you an idea of the scope, the scale of what Reed's vulnerabilities mean in the real world. So you can see them appearing and disappearing based on when they showed up in Shodan around the world. And this particular visualization is a little sparse because we've got, I think, 153 results for the different things that he discovered. And we can see where in the world they are and what's going on. So that gives you an introduction to the kind of comic book visualization that I'm trying to portray of the state of networking and connectivity in industrial systems. So that brings me on to my actual presentation proper. Okay, so I sometimes feel like I'm measuring glass houses, and I think that's kind of what this lady's doing. And I also see a lot of like cognitive dissonance in this industry, where you say, we're not connected to the internet. We're never connected to the internet, particularly when I worked for a vendor who shall remain nameless, especially today. They would repeat to us, like, we don't need to do this kind of security testing because these systems are never connected to the internet. And I heard that over and over and over when I worked there. And then you'd go and you'd look at a system and you'd think, you've got DNS. These guys are sending email. You get your patches from somewhere. What do you mean you're not connected? Okay, maybe you're going through a couple firewalls, but there is some level of connectivity here. And it got me questioning this. And also, more importantly, something the esteemed Ralph Langner said about these systems and people claiming that they're not connected. It's a very dangerous claim, also for vendors, not just for asset owners, but for vendors, because if you build your system without thinking about defending on an open network, then you build it differently. And it's my opinion that that's the fragility that we've seen in these systems, is because people comforted themselves with the idea that they were always present on a segregated network. So let's move into the presentation. My motivation was to discuss this concept of an air gap. What is an air gap, technically speaking? It's the absence of information flow, the absence of connectivity. Okay? How do you prove the absence of something, philosophically speaking? You can't, really. You can continually test for it. You can do some sampling. Are we connected to the outside world? But it's very difficult to prove. And so one of the things I want to do is reverse the burden of proof. It shouldn't be my job to come in and say, I've found a counterexample to your claim of being air-gapped. It should be your job to continually show that you have got an air gap. If you're going to make this claim to me when I come to visit you and do some consulting, I want to know how you know that. It's not just a faith-based argument. It goes back to the witch doctor stuff we talked about yesterday. You can't just say, I believe I'm not connected to the internet. So how do you test that? How do you actually prove that? The other thing I want to say is this is not, the air gap isn't everything. It's a baseline defense. It's a capability your organization should have for a period of time if you are under threat, right? So it's not like I think this is the way to save everything, but it's the baseline. You have to do at least this, and you have to have at least this knowledge about your network. So, given the scanning problem, I know a lot of people in here understand the scanning problem. Some people don't as much, so I'll define it very briefly. If you run these Nmap scans, these devices fall over. So as a researcher, I want to know, are these systems connected to the internet or are they not? How do I do that research? I can't just go scanning because I might knock something over, right? I'm caught in this moral quandary where you can't scan, so you can't show that they're connected, so you can't suggest building them differently, right? Okay, so Shodan comes along, and I think to myself, they've already scanned. ERIP comes along, they've already scanned. There's the data, right? And it's a public record of data. Now, I'm not interested in a case where a couple people have mistakenly configured a device and put it on the open internet. Fine, that happens. Mistakes happen. My question is this endemic? Is it systemic? And as a nation, how do we assure ourselves that most people are putting their systems in a sort of preferred state or closer to secure state? Okay. Vendors expect systems to be on segregated networks. I've seen this. It's in the requirements. They'll say in the OEM, like, never deploy this on the open internet, right? And they comfort themselves with this. Like, it's okay to have this TFTP server that just does whatever you tell it to because it's not on the open internet. Okay. On the other side, asset owners will think that their networks are segregated. They'll claim this. They'll pound the table and swear that it's the case. But how can you know that if you can't scan? If you can't run an Nmap scan across your network, or ARPWatch, or ARPScan, or choose your scanner. I'm a big fan of scanning. We don't have to use Showdown. In fact, I think there's much better tools to use for scanning. But the point is, how do you prove that to yourself and to your organization? Once again, going back to the fragility, if these systems aren't on air-gapped networks, vendors could build them differently. They could actually think about, authenticating data, authenticating firmware updates, all sorts of things. And that would focus that security experience and bring in the testers and bring in the development team to think about hostile data and hostile networks, right? As a case in point, we do this. We have 5 nines of reliability on other systems on the internet, like DNS routes, NTP servers. You can put things on the open internet and they can stay up and they can function to the level that millions of people around the world require. It can be done. It's done in other ways. So that's my aim. That's my motivations. Like, we should be discussing this level of connectivity and whether or not it's important to how we build these systems and whether or not it's led to this situation where they're more fragile than they should be. Okay, so in my project, I identified actually more than 33 queries, but I think these 33 queries will interest people here. Does anybody in this room recognize some tools or products or systems that they use? Yeah. I should say as well that I just spent some time with ABB. They're really wonderful people. When I found a couple thousand of these devices and showed them my results and went to spend some time with them, they came up to me and they did the nicest thing I've ever seen. They gave me one of the ABB web modules. They said, this is what you found. Here you go. Go and have a play with it. And that was really refreshing. That was a really refreshing response from a vendor. Okay, but everybody should recognize some stuff in here. Dylan Beresford's work. This is a weird, interesting soft PLC is used primarily in Eastern Europe. That's another reason to look globally. Things are a little different around the world, and it's kind of interesting to explore Europe and go, what do you guys do over there, and what does the US do? And I also think this is a global problem. It's not just a problem in the US. So let's talk about the internet. How did we know that these things are connected to the internet? I'm not going to pick on this particular vendor, but I read the manual, right? And there's a little clue here that these guys actually expect you to be connected to the internet. And if you look through the manuals, you're going to find this, not just in this one particular product, but in other products, right? So that was an early warning sign for me that there's some cognitive dissonance. It's like sometimes we say it's not connected to the internet, and sometimes we do. Okay. So everybody here knows what banners are. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but we're pulling banners down out of Showdown. For this particular project, we could pull them from eRIP. We could curl them. We could do whatever we want to get them. But what do they tell us about an individual system? So I'm just going to show you one, but for one particular product. But it's interesting how much they tell us, right? This makes me happy. This is fantastic. It's like you've tried to do some authentication. You've tried to say you can't connect to this device. Unfortunately, in the research that I did, I think it was 17%. Yeah, 17% gave me a 401, right? 53% gave me a 200. Okay, just connect. No problem, right? They might ask for a password after that, but you can pull back the banner and get some information. Now, why does that matter? What else is in the banner? Okay, we've got a time zone, so I know roughly what part of the world it's in. You can do other interesting things with time zones and OS fingerprinting as well. Okay, I've got a server tag. This is great. Look, this is the third-party software that you're running and probably not patching according to some of the stuff that Sean McBride was telling us. Okay, this is great. So I can see, what algorithm you're doing your authorizations with. These nonces turn out to be identifiable again in the future. Domains, there's tons of information in here, right? Okay, I don't care as much about the content length for my purposes, but if you were going to get into these configuration points, then you would. Character set gives me some interesting information, etc. Okay. So we've got a banner. This is the interesting bit. We break it down. So we do some regular expressions on it. I mean, this isn't clever stuff. You do some regular expressions, you get these tokens, right? And then I can go into exploit.db, also now part of Showdown, and search for exploits from known exploit databases. You know, this isn't zero-day stuff. This is, do I have any known exploits, right? Okay, so we search for each one of these using these tokens. And every product has a different structure and hierarchy of the regular expressions that I have to build, and that's a little bit done by hand, and that's covered in the paper that I gave to Dale. I'd like to automate that so it's unsupervised, but I need to like spend some time with some language processing, artificial intelligence type people to try and crack that problem. Because basically each one parses differently, right? But it can be done by hand, and it takes 20 minutes, an hour to look at a product and go, these regular expressions will break down these products, and I'll get back exploit results from the different databases. Okay, this is interesting. I've spent a little time with the standards lately. ISA 99 and NERC CIP say that you need to have an appropriate use banner for your different products. Okay, that's interesting, that's good. I didn't see any, right? I was speaking to Michael about this and saying, are you implementing these? And he was saying yes. So either I didn't see anything that was protected by NERC CIP, which I hope, that would be great, that's a great story. Or they're not being implemented, or they're not being implemented on web servers. We don't know yet, and that's kind of an unanswerable question, but it's interesting. If anybody else wants to talk to me about that, I'd love to spend some time with you. Okay, so this is more than just banners, okay? And some of you will have seen the ICS cert release. I've spent some time working with them. I want to thank them as well for dealing with the data, especially as I've come to understand they were simultaneously dealing with these guys, right? It's a lot of work. I realize that. So thanks again to ICS cert. And this is an example of the kind of data that I put together, because I synthesized a couple other sources in Showdown, particularly geolocation, which is now, well, I'll say more about that in a minute. But this is the kind of data that I was sending off to them, just saying, here's the IP address, here's the query that I used. So we can kind of hope that, 10,000 of these systems that we found are honeypots, or maybe they're demo systems. I don't quite believe it, but I hope, right? When you find 7 somatic, PLCs, okay, hopefully they're all honeypots. That would be great. That would make me really happy. And down here at the bottom are the exploits that I was just talking about that you pull back, right? So that's the kind of data I sent to them. So originally, how did the geolocation get done? I know I fail. I know I do things badly. I was a quality assurance guy for many years. So what I try and do is make those failures visible. It's kind of a Kaizen approach, right? Whenever you're doing something and you don't quite get it right, make sure you see your failures. And in fact, that's something that bothers me about computer security as well, is that a lot of security failures are silent. And that's terrible. We don't know when something's going wrong. We don't know when people have attempted 2,000 password attacks against our account. That's not a good situation. We want to visualize that kind of failure. We want to make it obvious. We want to see the network traffic. We want to know what's going on, especially when we're speaking to people who are not technical. When you want to go and speak to a politician and they want to understand, what did Reed just do? You want to be able to put this kind of a visualization up and tell them what's going on. So going back to this point on geolocation, I start off by putting everything just off the coast of Africa. I can see it's in the middle of the ocean. I know that if it doesn't get updated, I know that that data is not very useful for the geolocation purposes. And some of the results in Showdown do give you country equals none and city equals none. So this keeps me focused on some of the failures. So I think in the results set I'm going to show you, it's only like 2% of the data that ends up off the coast there. Okay. So if I can get the country at least, I put the average latitude and longitude of the country according to the ISO country code, ISO 3166. And I've learned some interesting stuff about ISO 3166. You stay up late at night reading these RFCs, and you find out cool stuff. So there's country code A1, which is one of the ones that threw me off in the data set that I gave to you guys, and that's a satellite provider. So it doesn't really tell you what country it's come from, but it's gone through a satellite link, which is great. And then I think A0 is other. Still haven't determined what that means. And I think A2 is anonymous proxy. Is it? Pigeons, yeah, okay. The RFC, yeah, very good. So if I've got this country data, then I at least put it in the average latitude and longitude of the country. Now, more than 75% of the data we have city and country, so we can do a Google Geo query, okay? So that's what I did for my dissertation. However, you can serialize all this information, which improves your performance. I'm going to come back to the performance and cost of this effort in a moment. But the best bit is Shodan now has latitude and longitude. John Matherly just added it just recently. So it's a one-stop shop to go for exploits, exploit searches, geolocation, and the queries for the banners. Now, it takes him about 3 months to scan through the entire IPv4 space. And how he does that, his sampling rate, there's a bunch of stuff there that you should speak to John about and not to me. But it's, it's maybe not the best source for some of these things. You'd rather do your scanning yourself and have more control of that and use different scanning tools. But that goes back to the scanning problem. You don't want to scan because you might break stuff, right? So at least this is a public repository, a sort of history, if you will, of connectivity on the internet. And I think that's particularly interesting to everyone here. If an individual person misconfigured a device or they put something on the internet and it's not critical infrastructure, fine. But what I want to propose to you is that shouldn't we be debating about this connectivity? Is this our go-to default strategy for defense? We're not connected? Or are we going to sometimes connect stuff to the internet and therefore we have to build it differently, right? And that's the debate I'm trying to promote. So now we have geolocation. Here's some raw numbers. Oh, that's terrible. I didn't realize that slide was so badly formatted. Okay. Anyways, you'll see it in the visualization, so it doesn't matter. Over the course of 2 years, which is how long Shodan's been gathering data, I was interested how many are coming up per week. And I came up with the number 79.5. Now, obviously, it depends on how many queries you're running and so on and so forth. But the other reason I was interested with this number is if, let's say I wanted to stream this data to ICS CERT, particular queries they found useful. And as Shodan updated, or any other scanning tool that I chose to use updated, I could stream some of the data to them that they were personally responsible for or that they were willing to move on to other people. And when we first started talking, there was like this lump of 7,000 nodes or something. We didn't know which queries were useful to them or interesting. We're still working that out. I'm still kind of doing quality assurance on myself and how I can help ICS CERT. But if you were only going to deal with 79 nodes per week globally, that's not too bad. You could send that to the certs and they could call them up and say, what are you doing online? Is this a garage door opener or does this control a pump for a hydroelectric plant? So how do you measure this kind of, if this was an attack effort, how do you measure that? The way I like to think about that is economics, cost and performance, right? So I'm also going to make another weird argument here, inspired by Richard Clayton, who's a really inspiring guy. He wrote this paper that I reference in Dale's book, Should Governments Clean Up Malware? And the basic case for this is that you can make the cost so low that it's like a public health effort. It's less than fluoridating the water, right? So that was my goal in this project. How cheaply can I tell you where ICS products are connected to the internet? If we want to remove them from the internet, then how cheaply and how quickly? My laptop is rubbish. I've got it's great in other ways, but it doesn't have a lot of processing power. And I can process these nodes in 1.3 seconds, right? With the geolocation, with the potential exploits, all that. However, talk to the ICS CERT guys. They have to phone these people up. It takes them weeks and months to get a response, if you get a response, right? So for me, asymmetry is really important. I can automate all this, and so can an attacker, but how do we get our society to handle this data? And I think your ability to react to these kind of data sets in the future is going to define defense in the digital realm. Okay, so what about cost? $2.18 per node discovery and processing for the Shodan data set. Now, where does that come from? I spent, sort of 3 to 6 months working on this, but basically 3 months part-time and 3 months almost full-time. And I was on a stipend. But let's say you're paying your average university master's student developer £15,000 for 6 months of work. That's where that comes from, right? So the cost of mitigation, we have to, we're talking about this, right? And there's a certain amount of data that you can understand ICS CERT doesn't want to say to me, oh yeah, in that particular case, you did find a refinery. That's fine, operational security, they can't tell me that story. But one of the things I'm hoping that we can find out is how much did it cost them to process the nodes on average? Because I think that's an interesting story, and I'll bet you it's a bit higher than that, right? But still, is it low enough that as a society we might institute these kind of vulnerability streams, these mitigation streams that we would handle? The value of the assets that these devices are connected to, it's probably more than a pint of beer, right? It's probably more than $2.18. So if I found something that wasn't critical and someone just sent an email and said, it's my garage door opener, it's no big deal, okay, fine. But on average, when you do find something, it's going to be worth more than that. Okay, so it appears to be cost effective if you do it at scale. If you ignore individual vendors and you don't focus on particular applications and you just use Showdown and you do stuff in a sort of country agnostic and vendor agnostic kind of way, it's reasonably cost effective. Okay. No doubt these kind of scanning techniques, much better than Showdown, much faster, are done offensively at the national scale. No doubt. Fine. I don't know of many defensive efforts. And that disturbs me a little bit because this is known stuff. You know, Nmap is not new. We've been using that for a long time. So why not defensively? Why not scanning defensively across your own networks and understanding the state of the network? I mean, we also talk about internet cartography in a larger general sense. DNSSEC, BGPsec, internet observatories, right? There's no reason that industrial systems couldn't take the same sort of approach and say, what is happening on the internet globally with infrastructure and industrial systems? All right, I'm going to show you a little bit more of the visualization in a moment as well, and I find that that usually induces a lot of questions. One of the critiques I have of my own work is that I've used lots of different queries, so I've looked at lots of different, it's not all PLCs like in the Basecamp. So in a sense, I've got this really, mixed bag. It's very different products. However, it's all low-hanging fruit. So from my point of view, it's easy to do, right? So using 33 banners, you could go out and find more banners. We get 10,000 results, 10,000 connections. Now, the 10,000 is important here as well because Showdown can have multiple results hitting the same node, right? Over 3 months, the same node can show up multiple times. And if it's bearing the same IP address, I correct for that by using a set, right? So I just eliminate all duplicates in my IP addresses. If they've changed IP address, they're on dynamic IP address, then I can't know that. I could spend a lot more time focusing on individual nodes, but I wanted to do this at scale. I wanted to know, is this level of connectivity a systemic issue? Is it symptomatic of a bigger problem? And in fact, I think it is. It's an economic issue, right? I got to go to work every day. I got to set up my equipment. It's important for me to log in from home because it saves me driving 200 miles to an RTU. I understand that argument. However, the risk to our critical infrastructure is a little bit higher than that. So again, I want to say thank you to ICS CERT, who coordinated this information with 63 CERTs worldwide. And I think that's a pretty amazing story as well, because you're sharing information with other countries, other countries that sometimes we don't always have a great relationship with. And I think that's really interesting, sort of global commons. We can all live a better life if we protect our infrastructure around the world. And I think that's really important. Okay, so another good story here is in 6 months, we can go back and look at this data. So Showdown is a public record of this stuff, right? So maybe in 6 months, we go back and we see that this effort with ICS CERT has produced a dip in the data. And I'm looking forward to doing that. It could also get worse. We could find there was more. And then we would say, well, why? And that's again, interesting stuff. Okay, so really simply, this is cheap. It's relatively fast to do. But remediation of these individual data points is comparatively slow. We know from Reed's presentation and from these guys doing the training, we know we have vulnerable devices and systems. We know they're fragile. We know they're incredibly fragile. So what's the big picture, right? Basically, there's enough of them deployed on the open internet to give me this white streak in my hair. It makes me really tetchy, right? And I'll show you that again, all right? So this is why I think visualization of this data is important. It's important for people who don't understand all the technical detail. And let's have a look at it. So this was Reed's again, and you'll notice there's individual points because we're focusing on just one product. This is all 30 queries over time, right? And if you just wanted a list, you could have a list. The green is no known vulnerabilities, no known exploits in the exploit database or Metasploit database. That changes over time, which is another reason that the visualization can be important. You could also do tabletop gaming, as Sean McBride pointed out to me in some analysis. He's interviewed in the dissertation for any of you who choose to read the dissertation. Where we do have known exploits here, I've put in the ID, and you can go and look up this string and find out more about it. Right? Okay. So over the 2-year time period that Showdown's been running, this is the 10,000 or so devices that we see around the world. I should say now as well, I'm pretty much done with the fixed portion of the presentation. So if you guys want to ask me questions, that's the best way to use this visualization, right? And this isn't, this is a general purpose tool that I mocked up quickly. But the point is, a student can put this together. Surely a nation state knows this much as well, right? So again, I'm perfectly willing to take questions and scroll along, and we can zoom in on individual countries. We're here in the U.S. today, so we can look at the U.S.
With Schweitzer, extremely valuable information, and what you're doing is extremely valuable to us. I think in a working relationship, it works real well. One of the problems we've received some notifications, and we've tried to pursue it. I'm a vendor. And when we tried to pursue those notifications from a researcher, we've reached an intermediary who did not actually own the equipment or manage the equipment. It was just the location or the ISP.
Right.
And legally, I can't go into their system to pull out the information I need to. So to you and to CERT, maybe, if you can find some way to do that, to give us more information, we can then track it down. For the ones we can get, we definitely pursued, and it helped out. And I think those customers, at least one of them I know, was saying, we didn't even know it was attached.
Right.
So great work.
Thank you. Thank you. So they didn't know it was attached. This is interesting, and that's addressed in the paper a little bit as well. If you are an asset owner and you are buying an IP space from an ISP under an SLA, it's possible you're buying a private IP space that isn't actually private. I don't have a way to prove that yet, but I'm thinking about that as the next paper. And Judith Rossboo over at ABB is really interested in this. Comes from a telecommunications background. She wrote basically a page in the paper that you'll read in the S4 proceedings about that issue. And we're interested in that issue. So if you've got evidence of that and how we would automate that at scale, because again, I'm not interested in an individual case of failure. I want to know if it's endemic. Then we would love to look at that. Yeah. But I realize that you run into this problem of mitigation, and it's different in other countries. So here in the US, you have to get the subpoena to speak to various people, and I'll let ICS CERT speak more about that because they know more about that. But we've also discovered in Europe that sometimes an IP address is considered private information. So it's personally identifiable information. I don't know why. Billy and I have been laughing about this, but the point being that some of the certs may not want the data because of what it contains, which is just, how do we address this? So we're dealing with all those sorts of problems in different countries and trying to work forward. And that's why I think it's, a research project more than just, a quiet little effort.
You may have already covered this. I missed the first few seconds, but you got roughly 10,000 SCADA devices out there and they're unique.
Say devices and systems, because some of them are like login points for a system.
Right.
Some of them are configuration points for a device. PLCs, RTUs, HVACs, meters. Yeah.
Now, some of them are garage door openers and some of them are demo systems. Any idea the ratio? Are most of them?
I wish, right? But like, again, I've had a couple conversations with the certs. Some of them wanted to remain anonymous. ICS cert, thankfully, were, and rightly so. I mean, they've done such a great job. They should be proud of it. But they'll come back to me and they'll give me a little bit of data, tiny bit. Stuff like, we have now processed all your tickets, and we would love to get data again from you in the future. So, and I want to improve my quality, right? So one of the things I'm hoping to do is maybe take this to the first conference, which is the Association of CERT Teams, and kind of go, if I gave you guys this data, is the quality good enough? What's missing? What do you need? And do some quality assurance on my own work, right? But I would love to know that number, like how much of it is critical. But you can also understand no nation state's going to turn around and go, this particular query is 80% critical infrastructure. Yeah, and that's understandable. But for research purposes, it's a real shame, because we could progress research a lot if we knew that sort of stuff. And I'm glad you asked me a question, because of course, some of the stuff that we can find is potentially customers for you and Waterfall.
Other questions or requests to zoom in on Reed's basement in there, or anyone else?
Sure. Yeah.
Any desire to comment?
And you want me to zoom out to sort of the global view again, or you want me to just go across? So they're appearing, disappearing based on their connectivity in Showdown. I could, of course, hit the same IP address again and see if it's still connected, and then connect this line across the top to say, like, this device has been connected this long. So I can change the visualization for different purposes. For me, one of the reasons I did this as an HTML page was, in the hope of being able to send the page itself to an individual CERT team or whoever was interested. And then you can view the data and you could tag it with, this is risky, this is high risk, this is low risk, whatever. So the visualization can be changed. But the real key here is not the individual tool. It's that, here's the story over time, right? And we've got a couple thousand devices. That says to me, we have more connectivity in this industry than we really think we do. Ralph Langner's presentation showed you what the high level is. You've got an air gap and you do some level of operational security and you still get it wrong. This is the baseline. This is the lowest common denominator, right? Now the next question is why? It's it's not because people are stupid. It's economics or it's something else, right? So let's find out why, right?
Kevin Hemsley with ICS CERT. Just want to thank Eireann for providing this information. We did coordinate, and we're continuing to coordinate what we can. A lot of it, and has been brought up by, I'm sorry, I forgot your name was Schweitzer. Dwight, sorry. That's one of the big problems we have in the U.S. is we have other researchers have also found systems in the U.S. and often, unless we get lucky, we often aren't able to contact the owners without a subpoena. And so unless there's something else involved, that's difficult to do. In the event of coordinating with the foreign certs, some other countries have access to that data and it's a lot easier. And yeah, normally they don't come back and provide much detail other than thank you. But we did have, I was in Europe a few months ago and I had multiple certs in Europe who sought me out to thank me and to pass along to you their thanks for coordinating this information. So it's made an impact.
Good.
Andrew Ginter, Waterfall Security. I just wanted to offer the thought that it's great the work you're doing. I do think additional research is needed, and here's some numbers to sort of try and put this in perspective. I ran some numbers the other day just to try and figure out how many medium to large size infrastructure sites there were in North America, and I came up with 30,000. Mm-hmm. I would expect there's a comparable number in other developed nations, and presumably fewer in the less developed nations. And control systems go with these sites in developed nations. I was also speaking to a researcher who was doing some work with building control systems, HVAC, and there's some between 7 and 9 kinds of control systems in all modern large buildings. Mm-hmm. And his estimation was that there's some 10 times as many of these buildings as there are medium to large size control systems, forget small ones. And so the numbers are huge. Mm-hmm. And so 10,000, if in fact these are critical infrastructure, then that's bad. That 10,000 is very bad. But it's a huge space, and we do need to try and understand what is it that you're discovering here.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And that's one of the flaws of this approach to research, but a lot of what I was doing was limited by the time I had and what tools I had available to me and so on. But we are interested to follow up with people, and so anyone who's been touched by this and wants to get in touch, I'm willing to keep a lot of things anonymous, especially if you can give me something I can publish about the data. So if anyone was reached as part of this project and wants to quietly say, I was critical infrastructure and you found me, I won't tell you which IP address or what query or whatever, that would be fine, right? But the other point about building management systems, they may not be critical infrastructure. I cover this in my dissertation. Criticality is a really funny context-based issue. And we love to say things like critical national infrastructure, right? But Ireland gets their gas, basically, from the UK, 80%, right? And they that flows across pipelines, across the Irish Sea. So the critical infrastructure on which Ireland depends is in Britain, the pumping stations for this gas, right? We don't, we live in this globalized economy, and we still want to have this little tight set of this is our critical national infrastructure. The reality is we depend on Nigerian pipelines to get the oil to the US to be able to buy our gas at the right price, right? That's the reality. So it is a global issue from my point of view, and that's the stance that I take. So going back to that criticality, it's hard to measure, it's hard to understand, might be critical to a small business. And if you've read the Rinaldi 2001 paper on the second order effects of critical infrastructure failure, nth order effects are what we're worried about, right? So one small mom and pop water station happens to be in the US, but if that water station feeds a refinery that needs the water to process, the hydrocarbon cracker, then, there are other effects further downstream of the failure of small water facilities or electrical facilities or telecommunications facilities.
Okay, we have time for one last question if there's one more. No? Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.